Hi folks, welcome back to Lecture 3 on the New South and a nation that is beginning to industrialize. We've already taken a look at westward expansion and how hundreds of thousands of Americans and immigrants from abroad were moving across the Great Plains in the aftermath of the Civil War. But what about the remainder of the country? Let's come back now to the South to begin with. Remember that since the majority of the fighting took place on Southern soil, we see that the region's infrastructure has been devastated by years' worth of protracted conflict. And even more than a decade after the close of hostilities, we still see entire railroad systems non-functioning. We see telegraph lines that have not been restrung, bridges have not been rebuilt. Why not? Because no one has any money to repair these things. That is until we start to see federal funding being sent to the South as a result of the Compromise of 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes made several concessions to his Democratic rivals in order to achieve the White House. One of the things he agreed to do upon taking over control was to start channeling federal funds to the South to help rebuild its infrastructure. Well, by the early 1880s, this federal monetary assistance was on its way, finally kickstarting the region's economy almost 20 years after the war. In addition to federal funds, we will also start to see northern investors coming to the South looking for business opportunities. And what they will do is identify a lot of natural resources that the South has and then begin to pour money into establishing industries that will capitalize on some of these natural resources. For example, it will be northern investors coming down and looking at areas of the Appalachian Mountains and noticing that these would be prime spots for the coal mining industry. These well-heeled financiers and businessmen then begin sinking money into extracting these natural resources such as coal. So the mining industry will be one of the first to appear in the South after the Civil War. Related to the mining industry will be the steel-making industry. Birmingham, Alabama did not exist, for example, before the Civil War. It was only founded in 1871 and grew rapidly after the discovery of huge amounts of iron ore, coal, and limestone, all within a nearby vicinity. These all happen to be the raw ingredients necessary to make steel on site. The textile industry will also be another that will begin to blossom in the South after the end of the Civil War. The textile industry had largely been confined to the Northeast before the conflict, despite the fact that all the raw materials for making cloth or textiles were being grown in the South. Think cotton. After the war, northern investors come down and they see these huge fields of cotton already being grown, and they say there's no reason for us to continue shipping this raw material all the way to the Northeast. Let's go ahead and create textile factories here to spin and weave this cotton that's been grown here on site into cloth. If you'll notice, I keep referring to northern investors. It is not Southern businessmen that have the ability to sink the amount of capital needed to begin many of these enterprises during the period. They don't have the money. Take a look, if you will, at the chart that I have here on the slide showing the regional per capita income as part of the U.S. average for the years 1860 in this first column and then 1880. You'll notice that the Northeast already tended to dominate in per capita income even before the Civil War, while the South lagged behind. Look, however, at some 15 years after the end of the war in 1880, the South as a region, its per capita income has dropped from 72% of the U.S. average to only 51%. This graphically illustrates this period of Reconstruction in which there is just no money to be had in the region to help kickstart businesses. That's why it will be outside investors. It will be those coming from the north to the south that will have the capital necessary to get the region's industries up and running during this period. Not all Southerners were appreciative. Some of these Northern investors were considered to be almost parasites feeding on the region. There were kind of disparaging terms applied to them, scalawags and carpetbaggers. Nonetheless, for many leaders in the South, many political leaders in the South, they welcomed all of this capital coming from Northern investors. In fact, what we see among many business leaders and politicians and even journalists like Henry Grady, they will begin selling the South as the next best region for investors to come into. They will begin to carefully craft a public relations campaign to depict the South in a much different light. The old South, they argued, was one based upon slavery and racial strife and what have you. The new South, though, that's the term that will be coined by many of these Southern progressives or boosters seeking to attract industry. The new South was different. The new South was the idea that the region was looking to the future now rather than to the past, and that the residents of the region were eager to work and that they were ready to industrialize. You can see this primary source that I have here on the slide. Henry Grady is trying to attract Northern investors. He's speaking to the New England Club in New York City in 1886, and he is presenting a largely false idea of the South. You can see here that he's addressing some of the reservations that many Northern investors might have in investing in the South, a region that had practiced slavery. Northern investors had heard about the horrors and outrages being committed against freedmen and women by groups like the KKK, and some of them were understandably reluctant to invest in such a region. They don't want to support such violence. Grady, however, says here in his speech that let the record speak to the point. No section of the country, he's basically saying, shows a more prosperous laboring population than the Negroes of the South, none in fuller sympathy with the employing and landowning class. He shares our school fund, has the fullest protection of our laws and the friendship of our people. The relations of the Southern people with the Negro are close and cordial, he said. Hopefully, you've already been able to learn in my previous lectures that this is a flat-out lie, that we're seeing segregation taking root and becoming more of a problem, not less of a problem over time. But this public relations campaign works. Many of these Northern investors say, well, he's from the South, he must know what he's talking about. In other words, the idea of the New South is a lie. It presents the South as a place where all the racial strife of past years has been put away and everyone gets along just fine and is treated equally. The city of Atlanta commonly billed itself during this period, for instance, as, quote, the city too busy to hate, unquote. But the more things change, the more they stay the same. All of this newfound economic prosperity in the New South still did not benefit the majority of poor farmers, both black and white. While it is true that many new industrial jobs were created during the 1880s and 1890s, the majority of Southerners still remained in agriculture. It's the only job they know how to do, the only employment they have ever known. Not to mention there was strenuous competition for these newly created factory jobs. They tended to be higher paying than in agriculture. It was a reliable paycheck, unlike in agriculture where if it rains too much or it doesn't rain enough and your crops don't come in, you risk starving to death. But agriculture was paying less and less as time went by. Indeed, during the period, the price of cotton, still the most widely grown crop in the region, was plummeting due to worldwide overproduction. In 1889, for instance, cotton prices dropped to an all-time low of 5 cents per pound, down from 25 cents a pound in 1868. As a result, many farmers, both black and white, were working the same amount each year, but getting paid less and less for their labor. What this means is that many Southerners were falling further and further into debt each year as they had to take out loans to buy new equipment, to pay rent on the land. For some, this meant over time that they simply lost their land outright, or in the case of former slaves, they never were able to own land. This results in the growth of a new labor system emerging in both the South and in other parts of the country, known as sharecropping. So how did this sharecropping system work? Wealthy landowners who were rich in land but poor in labor, now that slavery had been abolished, devised a labor arrangement with former slaves and poor white farmers, whereby they simply divided up their lands and assigned certain plots to individuals willing to work and plant crops on it. Under this system, the landowner would rent the property on a yearly basis to these sharecroppers in exchange for a percentage of the crop at the end of the harvest year, or a share of the crop, hence the name of the system. While the arrangement varied from place to place, a typical split was 1/3 of the crop going to pay rent, 1/3 going for food, tools, seed, etc., with the remaining third left to the farmer as profit at the end of the year. That sounds somewhat reasonable, doesn't it? But it's actually not. It's a highly exploitative system that preys upon the sharecropper. Take a look at another primary source that I provided for you, in this case a sharecropper's contract from Louisiana in 1879. The owner of the land, I couldn't make this up if I tried, guys. The owner of the land's name was Solid South. And the sharecropper was John Dawson. And so they're signing this contract for the crop year of 1879. Look at what the sharecropper is responsible for. The sharecropper has to manage all ditches, turn rows, bridges, fences. He has to pay for that. Now, I don't know how many of you have rented an apartment, rented a house, but if the faucet breaks in a rental house, do you have to pay for it as a renter? No. It is the owner of the home. It is your landlord that should have to pay for the upkeep of that property. Not so with the sharecropping system here. So you have a sharecropper who has no money, no land, no nothing, and he is having to pay for the upkeep of someone else's property. Further, this particular contract stipulates that the sharecropper has to have his cotton ginned. That just means de-seeded. That all cotton raised on this land must be ginned by the landowner, Solid South, meaning that you can't shop it around at the end of the year. You can't compare prices and say, I'm going to have my cotton de-seeded or ginned by this guy because he only charges $1 a pound. No, you don't get to shop it around. You must do it from the landowner's cotton gin. And so the landowner, therefore, has no incentive to give you a bargain rate. If anything, they're going to inflate prices. Are you getting a sense of how exploitative this system can be? The sharecropper is being nickeled and dimed to death by the landowner. Ultimately, the sharecropper simply gets trapped in a cycle of poverty. If you have a few bad harvest years, or more likely, as you begin to see crop prices across the board sliding due to overproduction, and you're working the same amount each year and you're getting paid less and less, then you're going to have to start taking out loans from the landowner. You may not make any money off this year's crop once you've paid the share to the landowner, once you've replaced your tools and what have you. You may have to take out a loan also from the landowner, and then you just get trapped in this cycle of poverty. You just are never able to break out of it. You only continue to accumulate debts. This is a form of economic slavery, meaning that you're never going to pay off all your debts. You're pretty much stuck on this piece of land trying to pay off your debts to the landholder. And this will not just be confined to the South. You can see from the map that I have here on the slide that sharecropping, the highest percentage of sharecropping was in the Deep South states, but you also see huge numbers in the Upper South states. You also see sharecropping in the nation's Midwest. This represents a huge number of agricultural laborers throughout the country who are seeing their economic fortunes eroding in front of them during the late 19th century. Economic hardships also affected race relations in the region. White farmers, frustrated at falling cotton prices, often lashed out at black farmers, despite the fact that black farmers were usually in an even poorer position themselves. Anti-black riots broke out during the period from Wilmington, North Carolina, to Atlanta to Louisiana, and lynchings of blacks rose alarmingly during the late 19th century. We're going to talk more about race relations here in the second part of this lecture.